I am so happy that so many of you chose to join us to hear about our report, The Futures We Create, Democratizing the Imagination of the Future. This event is being recorded, and each of the over 1,300 people who registered will receive a link to that recording. I'm Laura Melichar, and I direct the Ideas for an Equitable Future team at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And I'm thrilled today to be with two of the report's contributors, Lafayette Cruise and Laura Nissen, and RWJF's current futurist in residence, Joan Mukogosi. I know that we have folks here from around the world in many different time zones with many competing priorities. So before we go to the future, I'd love to get a sense of what's going on in your world right now. Please use the chat function to tell me and others what's one word that describes the energy you are bringing to our conversation today. Thank you so much. As I've said before, my name is Laura Melichar, and I direct the Ideas for an Equitable Future team at RWJF. For over 24 years, this team has been tasked with anticipating and influencing the future, 5 to 15 to 50 years from now. We fund projects, including the work of professional futurists, to help spot signals that may indicate emerging trends that will impact our collective work towards a future where health is no longer a privilege, but a right. We also fund experiments that attempt to harness trends that are likely to be good for health equity in the future and mitigate harms from trends that will either create new inequities or exacerbate existing inequities. Through this work, we've come to understand that to get to the future we want, we must first imagine the future we want. Over the past 7 years, we've been funding futurists who are helping to do just that, using their various approaches to futures thinking. They've helped us understand that futures thinking, or futuring, is not about trying to predict what will happen. It's about observing what is happening and anticipating what that might mean for the future early enough to do something about it. It's also, paradoxically, about ignoring everything that's happening in the present to dream up completely new preferred futures so that we can backcast alternative trajectories that can help get us there. Because the stories about tomorrow that we are telling today can become the blueprints for so many possible tomorrows. We've learned so much from these leaders as they actively bring their futuring practices to organizations and communities that are working together to dismantle structural racism in the systems that produce health. We've seen the energy rise as people co-create visions, revealing inspiring futures worth fighting for, and surfacing steps they could take now to advance to those futures. We've seen that it's imperative for all organizations and communities to have the time and the space and the tools to anticipate, adapt to, and influence the future. That we must democratize the imagination of the future. The Futures We Create report, which centers our conversation today, describes the work of 13 future practitioners and shares rich insights, lessons, and tools from them and many others that may prove helpful in your work. And it raises provocations about what's needed from all of us for more organizations and communities to apply futuring to their work. My hope is that today's conversation convinces you that taking the time to anticipate the future can accelerate progress towards your goals, underscores the value of co-creating inspiring futures that are worth fighting for with the members of the communities that have the most to gain from these futures, and get you excited to read and reread this report and to share it with people in your network that you think will be similarly inspired. Those of you who have already been perusing the report will notice that we constructed it with a choose-your-own-chapter approach. Futuring is not a linear process, nor is learning. We don't often have the time to read a report start to finish in one sitting. We wanted you to be able to jump into it at any entry point according to your exposure to these concepts and your interest in the contents, to jump into the chapter that most intrigues you, and to come back again and again as your future's journey and bandwidth permit. In that spirit, we've invited Laura and Lafayette and Joan to choose the chapter that was most resonant to them and to tell us why. Lafayette Cruise is a futurist, urban planner, artist, and educator. He serves as the Regional Arts and Culture Planner for Boston's Metro Area Planning Council, and he also teaches at the Rhode Island School of Design. Laura Nissen is a foresight practitioner, social worker, researcher, and former dean and professor with the Portland State University School of Social Work in Oregon. She is also a research fellow with the Institute for the Future. Lafayette and Laura are two of the people who so generously contributed insights you can find all over our report. Our third speaker is Joan Mukogosi. Joan is an Afrofuturist, social scientist, and an affiliate with the Data and Society Research Institute, working at the intersection of technology, health, and identity. She also currently serves as the Foundation's Futurist in Residence. So I'm going to have a conversation with our three speakers for about half an hour, and then we're going to invite you all in to ask questions. Please use the Q&A function at any time for any questions for the panelists. You'll see a button at the bottom of your screen. And feel free and encouraged to post your thoughts, ahas, and hunches in the chat as we go along. To get the chat going again, I'm going to turn to Joan Mukogosi, who has a question she would like for you to answer.
Hello, everybody. I'm so excited to be here today, and I see folks sharing the energy that they're bringing today in the chat. And perhaps to build on the energy that folks are bringing, I have a question for everyone to tap into our feelings around the future. So I'm going to invite everybody again to share in the chat one word to describe what the future feels like. And I will read out some words that I see as they flow into the chat. So let's see. I'm seeing a lot of fear and uncertainty, which really resonates with me in the current moment. I see a lot of urgency and opportunity, which I think is a really great balance there. Um, Brittle is a really interesting feeling. What else? Uncertainty, I see a lot. Hope, diversity, just possibilities. I love these. Not all of these are feelings, I might add. And I welcome you as we sort of continue in this conversation to, yeah, tap into maybe the emotions that come with asking folks to step into the future. Perhaps I'll present a feeling that I am feeling when it comes to what the future feels like. And to me, the future feels free. And maybe that speaks to a bit of the uncertainty, um, and the anxiety that I'm seeing in the chat, as well as some of the hope. Yeah, thank you all for sharing, and I'll pass it back to Lori.
Well, before you go anywhere, I'm gonna hang on to you. I noticed a lot of the folks in the chat, as you noticed, we're feeling uncertainty, we're feeling fear, we're feeling anxiety. I wonder if we should redo this survey at the end of this webinar after they've read the report, because we're really hoping that there is inspiration in this report that can help folks really learn to love the future and create visions that will make them more folks on the opportunity hopeful side, but really appreciate people sharing where they are. So while I have you here, Joan, as I said, we've asked each of you to tell us which chapter of this report that folks shouldn't miss, which most resonated with you, and I'd love to hear what you have to share.
Yeah, it was really challenging for me, honestly, to choose a chapter. For folks that know me, I'm a huge annotator. I write a lot in the margins. That's just how I process and retain information. And so I tried to go off of what my most annotated chapter was, but it was like a very even sort of lay of the land when it came to how much I was annotating. But I think chapter two really resonates with me a lot as a futurist because I think it really gets to the purpose of the report, but also the purpose of, for me, like futurism as a practice writ large, by really asking what this work means. And I think the answers that the folks that were interviewed poured into that chapter really resonate with me. Because they describe futurism as this very like purpose-filled practice. And again, maybe this speaks to some of the meaning and anxiety, like how we can sort of confront those feelings through futurism, if that makes sense. But the opening quote of that chapter, the Ursula Le Guin quote, which is incredible, really like sets up the stakes as well for futuring. I think, you know, she really describes how this work is important because it challenges and relocates power. And I think that's where this idea of democratizing also comes through for me as well. But yeah, I don't know. I wanted to uplift also. There's this quote in that chapter that imagination is a form of prayer. And that really, I mean, that sticks with me a lot. I think about, again, futurism, not just as this sort of like heady academic thing that we do, but as this practice that really transcends boundaries. Like it it folds in between like the personal and the political, between like dreams and reality, between work and play. I think it really requires us to sit in that in between space and see what comes out of it. And yeah, honestly, like reflecting on, as you brought up in the beginning again, like hearing from you all in the chat, these feelings of fear and anxiety, I don't want to sort of pass by that too quickly. And if you will allow me, I think another chapter in the report really speaks to this, which is chapter 6, which feels like a foil in a way to chapter 2, because chapter 6 really flips this question about what the meaning and purpose of futurism is towards a question about capacity, and about inequality. And I think that's so important because that's kind of what I'm hearing, in the chat, if that makes sense. Like, I don't know, as a futurist, I think perhaps this resonates with other people who do that work, but futurism is exciting, it's inspiring, it's hopeful, it's all of those things. But to get to that place where we're accessing those feelings around futurism, we have to confront the other side of that, which is grief, which is
Mm.
fear and terror and anxiety, which really speaks to the present moment. And I think this chapter is such a great outline of how to really take those feelings seriously, and meet people where they're at. And I think that is our job as futurists. I think that is the important work of anybody who is curious about how to sort of fold futuring into your life and into your practice, that it does not have to be solely this speculative and sort of optimistic practice. It's also something that can carry and hold space for our fear and our anxiety. And yeah, I think, it just goes to say that you can have all the drive and all the purpose, that's raised in chapter 2, and really have that desire to engage in futurist work, but be completely under-resourced, to be able to actually do that work. And so, yeah, I think perhaps those chapters pair really well. And yeah, sort of give me a good signal for how to engage this work going forward is to hold both of those truths at the same time, that this is something that carries a really beautiful practice. It can be prayerful, as I mentioned earlier, but it can also be a space for mourning. And so yeah, I hold those two things with me a lot in this work.
Great. I'm so glad you mentioned the different quotes that are in this report. This report is full of quotes, and some of them are full page, beautiful quotes that you can print out and stick on your wall, including two of the ones that you just mentioned. And I also it was reminding me, at least when you're talking about chapter 2, about the fact that so many different people come to futuring with so many different origin stories. Some come because it's fun, some come because they have no other choice. There are all kinds of attitudes and feelings that bring you into futuring, and so many different things that people find there. We often remark that some of the folks who are in this report didn't call themselves futurists. We saw them as doing futuring work, but they wouldn't have taken that label themselves for reasons that we talk about a bit in the report. So thank you. Great to hear that those two resonated, and it's also always a great thing for us to remember that we can hold two things can be true at the same time. And in fact, wrestling with it is really our job in this era.
Yeah.
Great. All right. Well, I'm going to bring in Lafayette next. Lafayette, tell me
Hello.
which chapters do you think folks should jump into first or be sure not to miss?
I think similar to Joan, had difficulty choosing. But I love chapter one and five in particular, and I think based off of what you were talking about with Joan, it makes sense for me. I Chapter one is really about needing more people to imagine the future.
Mm,
Um, I think in this moment, it feels very like we don't get a say in the future that we're careening towards.
mm,
And I think because there isn't enough specific alternatives, and we don't have the capacity to. It's just like there's a singular story, and it's like actually we can break this up if we have more. And even trying to get more specificity in the stories that we tell of the future. And I think I appreciated that part of the chapter and all the different ways that folks are practicing that in chapter one. And I think chapter five. I like almost as a foil to chapter six in the same way that Joan was talking about like capacity and equality, because I think this needing to feel the future is an important thing. We're living in, I feel like we're consistently being told the story of a disembodied future.
mm,
I mean, even having a really great conversation, like not physically present, but there is, like I talked about it a bit in our chapter with the futurist writers room. That we did with the Guild of Future Architects. And when we had the series called 20 Decades from 2020, we brought in sort of somatic practitioner to try and help us be in our bodies in a
mm,
moment, like at the start of the pandemic, where it's like we could not be together. We do not know how to respond to this. So what does it mean to not just make sort of futuring and imagination an intellectual process, but really an embodied one, and really as we go into this work, how do we both feel and like build that knowledge into the feelings of our bodies, but also build practices of like what are the emotions we want to be able to feel in the future? I think
mm,
um, a lot of the chat was talking about sort of fear and anxiety, and I think about how like as a society, or at least speaking from the context of the US, it's like we do not feel.
mm,
We do not take time to grieve. We do not take time to joy or to feel joy. Um, I think of if you see someone just like walking down the street, just like shouting for joy, you think they're crazy, as opposed to like, actually, that's a very valid response to feeling something. We are not sort of this bifurcated, trifurcated being. We are sort of full. And so, how do we feel in the moment so that we know what it is we want to feel in the future?
mm.
Um, and it really I think of like intelligent mischief. I was glad to be like I felt very honored to be to be included in this chapter or just like in this report, like the work of intelligent mischief, or there's a group here in Boston, DS4SI, that does a lot of really interesting work of how do we embody and prototype the futures that we want to be in. So it's not just a story, but it is even our imaginations of the future aren't delusions. They are practical, they are tangible, they are legitimate. Yeah, I think especially as we are in this moment, I think of like freeze because it is so disorienting and dysregulating. We need more practices of like feeling in the moment and taking the time so that we can feel into the future. And so, um, yeah, I need more people to do that. Um need to hear more specific stories of what people want. Feel more specific stories of like what does like we talk about a positive future or an aspirational future, but we often use like these tropes, these terms like regenerative. Like, cool, what does that look like where you are? Because it looks different in your community than it does in mine, but I need you to tell me that story so that I can begin to imagine what that looks like in mine. And
And
so,
what that feels like.
yeah.
Yes. So I want to add a new quote. I'm going to have to the report, or I want this on a t-shirt or something. What are the emotions we want to be able to feel in the future? Which I feel like I've heard something close to that sentence before, but never those words put together in that way. I really also appreciate you bringing up, at least mentioning a couple of the tools that various futurists use that folks could find out. The Futurist Writing Room, I'm sure, sounds interesting to people, and they should look for that in the report. Even questions as simple as the question that Joan asked us is a tool to help us feel what the future feels like, and to think about if that's what we want to be feeling or not. You also did a little teaser for some of the really cool organizations that are doing futuring work. A lot of futuring is being done by individuals. It's being done by many people who have joined us today on this call. And some of you are lucky enough to be parts of groups and organizations. Dot Connector Studio is one. The Guild of Future Architects was certainly a place where folks gathered together. Intelligent Mischief, folks are going to want to go look up that. We had a futurist from the Institute for Love and Time in our report. So really encourage people to look to the report and also go down some rabbit holes to learn more about these amazing organizations. Thank you. I'll bring Laura in next. Laura, were you able to pick just one chapter?
I was not.
Are you
Hello,
going to
everybody.
juxtapose as well? All right.
Yeah, I had two chapters that I loved, and I'm so impressed and inspired by my fellow panelists. So just a joy to be here with you all, and a part of the RWJF family, lifting this information up. And hello to everybody. I love chapter 3 when disruption creates possibility, and chapter 5 feeling our way into futures. Um, I love this. Well, I'll start out just by saying. I think it's as has been discussed so brilliantly, we know that this is just a complicated topic, and we could see from the ways people put their words up there. We know in our gut something that a phrase I've heard recently, that anxiety is the inner pandemic right now. And anxiety is probably, I think, at peak levels globally. So this place of panic both excites us and inspires us at the same time. And as futurists, I think we enter the playing field knowing that we have tools and skills to help people. We're trying to create contexts where foresight feels natural and desired, useful in these very complicated times. So we're doing this delicate dance of trying to renew people's faith in the future and stoke their inspiration at the exact same time that they're often experiencing dread. And that's been sort of a through line of some of what's been discussed. I think we as futurists feel like that's possible. It's complex, but that's what makes futures skills, futures thinking and foresight skills so important right now, so right for the moment, and why we're all so excited about their possibilities, their really endless possibilities. I love this quote from Ed Finn, and I'm looking for a page number, but I don't see it. It's at the head of chapter 3. Building imaginative capacity is an essential collective project if we hope to successfully navigate the tidal waves of change that have already been unleashed. So I love this idea of foresight being a collective imagination project. My favorite, we're throwing out questions we love. One that I carry around that comes from Sohail Inayatullah and a tool called the Futures Triangle. Focus is on the question, what does the future need from us? And I love that question. That's my t-shirt question. And my answer is always, it needs more collective imagination. That's really what it's needing from us most of all. Moving into chapter 5, this feeling our way into the future. For me, it's always been about helping build, find, expand, and aim people's sense of agency right now about the future so that we just don't prematurely capitulate to futures we don't want. That we find collective sources or amplify collective sources of power, because we don't always need to find them. They're often right there. But how do we help each other amplify those senses of power? We need that in a powerful burst right now. Anxiety, despair, fear is at fever pitch. So cultivating respect for this vast diversity of people that all want to and need to be part of deciding what futures we have. I think is our most important task right now as a people, as a global community. Um, Nurturing collective imagination, uplifting this wide variety of scenarios, possibilities, and options in this shared sense of discovery and helping move us to really actionable pathways. That's why I think this work is so beautiful, has so much potential, certainly gets me out of bed. And lastly, I'll just say, for me, it also leads to, as someone who's, quickly becoming an elder, I'm 63. I'm feeling a sense of obligation to future generations. So this lifting that we do is not just for us in our lifetime; it's for all those that come after us, and our sense of intergenerational commitment and solidarity for many generations ahead. So anyway, those are my fave chapters. I adored them, and I just love the whole report. It's beautiful, it's fun, it's friendly, and I think it's really useful. So.
Great. Well, ending on useful. I'm sure so many who are here today will be excited to hear more and learn more about the actionable pathways. That this is not just a luxury. This is not just fun. This is not just a retreat activity, although this work does work very well for retreat activities, but it actually results in, it's useful and can result in some really actionable pathways. When you started talking about anxiety as the inner pandemic, I was reminded of a quote by Uma Viswanathan, who folks should know, was the person that I reference in my intro letter in the report. She's the RWJ staffer who first suggested to me that maybe not everyone has the time, space, and tools to imagine the future, and perhaps they should. And she hypothesizes that our uncertainty about the future and the different thoughts that we have about what the future is really increasing the divide and the conflict and the polarization in our society. And so I think there are so many reasons you may go into futuring. You may be really wanting to get to those actionable pathways. And I think that there can be so many externalities, I guess the economist would say, for engaging in this work. Great. Well, thank you so much. I'm going to bring Joan and Lafayette back into the room. And I'm going to ask a couple of questions just to get our conversation started. But if you have questions that you'd like to ask, please add them to the queue, as I said, by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And if you've already put one of your questions in the chat, if you could just copy it over to the Q&A, that'll make it easier to keep track of. Great. All right, well, I'm going to start with just a question for each of you. Lafayette, there's another quote. There's a quote from you that's in the report that I'm going to paraphrase as asking us to think about how to center the people who are marginalized now in our futuring endeavors. Is that a question that you think that you've answered for yourself, maybe using frameworks and tools from the traditions of Afrofuturism or polychrome futures, as I think you claim to come from? Or could you use thoughts from our community about how that can best be done?
Yeah, I don't think I found the answer to that. It's mostly just been a constant experiment of how do you find the margins in specific particular places. I think in the work that I'm doing now, as an arts and culture planner, it's like how to find artists who are at the margin, but also who are the marginalized in the arts and culture world, and then how do we tell a different story and give them the space to like tell a different story of this region. But yeah, I'm curious how Joan and Laura approach this because it's always, I think, in this moment, the margins feel the most rushed and oppressed for time and capacity. Um, that as much as I see their experience and imagination for the future as essential, the future is often made more um, imminent for them than it is for this thought process. So I'm curious how you all engage in that, just like different time scales of what the future is and how the pressure that produces.
Laura and Joan, what have you found to be helpful to center those who have, you could say, have been most marginalized, but I like to say have the most to gain really from new futures that we might enter into?
Joan, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, this is such an important question. I think one thing that comes to mind is one, I like to remind people all the time that they are futurists in their own lives in many small, different ways. There is a quote from the report, I forget who said it, but there's this affirmation that families will be their own futurists. And I think that's one place that we all engage in our own small little futurisms every day. And so, yeah, I think, this is not an entire answer to the question, but I do really try to remind people of all the ways that it's like all of our micro futurist acts that we make on a daily basis, on a weekly basis. And I think that's often a really good starting point for how to build and think more broadly about the future. Yeah.
I guess, Lafayette, I love you talking about artists because in my work, I'm always like, look for the artists. The artists are going to tell us things. And there's, a long time ago, many, many years ago, I was an art student, and when you study art history, you're always studying kind of the art of the dominant system, and then you've always got the artists pushing up. And look at those artists, what's happening on the streets. So that's one thing. But I'm also constantly scanning for examples of places where people are making the future right now, whether it's spaces of mutual aid, spaces of activism, spaces of new kind of movements that are percolating. And to me, those are very inspiring, very generative, and they're happening everywhere. So in very fractal kind of ways. They're not hierarchical, they're non-hierarchical. And so to me, the future is very non-hierarchical. And you can't just, I think our brains were so socialized to look for like traditional leaders or organizations, but I have to think more fractally as I'm, scanning for things, signs of hope. And people who are making the future right now. When I look at a beautiful mutual aid situation, I think, man, those are some future makers right there. They see possibilities where nobody else did, and they're loving each other through this really complicated time. That is just the most inspiring thing ever. And I don't want to romanticize it because there's enormous pressures and difficulties and, all the things that go along with that. But the truth is, there's a lot of beautiful futuring going on where people are creating futures right now. So I'm constantly just trying to find them.
Yeah, great. I love that you brought in the concept of fractals that I learned about first through Adrienne Marie Brown's Emergent Strategy book. Adrienne is one of the futurists who's featured in our report as well. I wanted to go back. I'm going to turn to you, Joan. I'm going to build on this a little bit more because it's challenging enough to really understand and make actual the engagement of members of as many communities as we need and can and have capacity to bring in to envision futures. But Uma, again, in the report, provokes us to also bring in those who perhaps don't share the same visions of the futures. And in fact, who might be detractors, she calls. She says, she's offering hypotheses. You may want folks who can push and question and challenge. There's many reasons not to engage with people who want to cause you harm and could cause you harm. And what do you think about this idea, and or how might you bring folks in to have them think through the things that they maybe haven't thought about in order to make their visions resilient?
Yeah. I mean, I think what I'm hearing in this question, like this is a question really about what democratizing looks like in action. And this is something I've been thinking a lot about in my own practice, which is sort of looking for folks for whom the future is murky. It's unclear. I've used this phrase in other spaces, but for whom the future is dead or dying. And I think that is, a feeling and experience that we see all around us. And again, I felt resonated a bit in the chat today. And I think it's important to as you said, engage folks who have entirely different perspectives, perhaps on the future, and also to be really well studied in those perspectives as well. Perhaps it doesn't mean inviting them into our space, but it does mean really understanding the motivations behind their perspectives. And, going back to the quote that I mentioned at the beginning, that this work is important because, you know, we're living in other people's imaginations of the future right now. I think it's really important to understand those imaginations. And so, right now, for me, I think that means engaging with what a future, for example, for the climate looks like. Should we believe in and sort of invest in these very dystopian futures that we see folks pouring money and energy into? And sort of engaging that futurism as perhaps not as valid as our own perspectives, but just as important to carry with us as we try to perhaps alter that path. And so, yeah, I think, democratizing the future in that sense doesn't always mean inviting everybody into our space, but it does mean very, like, taking very seriously everyone's perspectives on the future, and carrying them with us as we do our own imagining. Yeah.
Laura, related to this, you talk in the report, or we quoted you as talking about anticipatory trauma. How do you think about anticipating anticipatory trauma, whether it's in the futuring exercise, or in the future?
Well, I mean, I think one of the revolutions that's happened in mental health in the last 15 years is really acknowledging the presence, the ubiquity of trauma in the world around us. Like there's just so much trauma, and so much of what's happening is related to a sense of individual trauma and collective trauma. And I got to playing around one day with just the idea of what would trauma informed foresight look like? How do we have trauma informed futuring practice? And I guess that's just part of, what I was getting to before about I think we do not want to traumatize people, but we need to enter the space acknowledging that they come with their own freakouts in play about what's happening, what has happened to them already, what is happening to them right now, and what might happen ahead. And trauma informed, I think, begins first and foremost with just acknowledging that trauma is very real and that things have happened to all of us on the way here. And we're all bringing that into these rooms. So calming our nervous systems, getting into our bodies, Lafayette, as you were talking about, somatic work. These are things that can inhibit or accelerate our imaginations, as Joan was alluding to as well. So I think it really, what we don't want is for people to get locked into anticipatory trauma in a way that prevents them from really engaging in the thoughtful, spiritual, creative, intellectual, relational work that is foresight at the best. And so just sensitively moving into that space, which means all of us as futurists really taking that seriously in ourselves as well. And I love Jose Ramos is another wonderful futurist I follow and have learned a lot from, and he talks about kind of the inner work of futuring. It's not just an out there around us intellectual process. Each of us who does this work has a kind of obligation to be doing some inner work of futuring, and yeah, so that's how I would come at that.
Great. Thank you. I have one more question for all of you, and then we'll get to the questions that folks have been posting like crazy in the Q&A. And that is how you approach as futurists. And I would love also the futurists, there's so many in our audience to weigh in on this as well, how you approach the opportunities you are given and or you take to engage folks in futuring activities. There's so many different tools. There's so many different things to do. I tend to put them in two categories. I'm sure others would put more. And I mentioned this in the introduction, that some of the work of futuring is to see what's changing on the fringes and then try to understand if that's a trend that we should be anticipating in the future. Sometimes you might be able to shift a trend. Often you just need to anticipate it. The AI is coming. We need to anticipate what that might mean for our work. System and another category would be those who forget what's happening now. Let's really forget what's happening now, forget those systems, and really imagine new systems and to try to see what kind of inspiration and also just practical, useful pathways we might imagine there. There's a lot of conversations right now in many of the communities that RWJF is in touch with about the fact that so many of our systems, which weren't serving very many, we're not serving a lot of people, are being torn down, and that the tearing down is hurting people. And there are those who are saying that this is an opportunity to envision new futures and new systems. Um, how do you approach a group to understand whether what they really need to do is have inspiration to just anticipate what is coming versus to think about something completely new? Or do all groups need both?
I can take a stab at this one first, and then I'll pass it to you all. I I think that's an interesting like framing that you presented us with, like these two different paths for engaging people in futurist work. I would say for me, the first step is always, I think in no matter what type of futuring activity that we're engaging, big or small, there's two things that I think happen every time in that space. One is holding and addressing, as we've mentioned so many times, trauma, fear, anxiety. And the other is really nurturing imagination. And I think maybe like to toss it back, like that's the two-part balance that I always try to weigh, is how much time do we need, does this group need, or do even I need to address the barriers to my imagination, to address the anxiety that I'm holding, not just about the future, but also that I'm carrying with me from past experience or that I'm feeling that day. And then how expansive can I be with my imagination? It's almost a question of also of like, how silly do I feel today? Like, how much am I willing to engage like my wildest dreams? And again, like a question that I pose back to folks as well is like, how big are we feeling that we can dream today? And I think that sort of sets the stage for how to do this work. And I think it's a good set of questions to ask yourself too, before you try out any of the activities. Yeah, I don't know, Lafayette, Laura, if you have other answers to that.
I have a thought. Okay to jump in, Lafayette?
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, Lori, when you said all that, I just kept thinking about the future is political. I mean, if you think about it, all politics is competing ideas about the future. Right. And so, and we have a very us and them, either or, this way or that way kind of system around us. And we don't have to look very far to see everybody locked into this or that. And certainly the discrepancy, the differences seem profoundly clear. That said, for me, there's just always this sense of power. There's always a sort of dominant or used future that's being asserted is the right one or the best one or the inevitable one. And I just don't usually buy that. Even about the AI conversation, which is I see signals of people saying AI, talking about AI at college graduations, prestigious graduations, getting booed. Like there are signs out there, signals that not everybody's on board with the idea that it's just inevitable. So again, resisting premature capitulation. I think one of the things that futures and Jaime Caseo has a model where he talks about neuroflexibility is kind of needed. We have to, I think, and futures thinking can help us get there, move beyond kind of either or, and really like something outside that, stuck place where we so commonly get to in contemporary political discourse, or win losers. We know if we don't deal with climate, we're all losers. Like there's not just winners and losers there. There's only losers if we don't deal with climate. So thinking bigger than winning and losing, I think is needed. But for me, everything that you just said, Lori, hinges on issues of power, politics, who's asserting a used future that's inevitable, and who has the right to push back on that. That's how I make decisions as I move into any future situation. So anyway, that's what comes to mind. Lafayette, take
Yeah.
it.
I was like, I just love learning from you all and hearing from you all because I think, yeah, even to the point you were making, Laura, of like even the narrative around AI or the like signals that we're getting. Um, I like the work of Dr. Mark Jung in his book Racial World Making, in particular around this idea of like the trope and how that pl shows up in like politics. And I know for me, my work, I like relate it to planning, but I think there are ways in which big pictures of the future rely on tropes, and when we don't have a practice of be embodied futuring, or even Joan, you brought up like micro futuring, we have to rely on the trope. And a lot of power, a lot of inequality is often hidden in sort of the imagine like the tropes that we rely on. And I think to this question of just like responding to what's here, but also saying what we want, it's a bit of being able to take the time to do these micro futures and be like, I'm saying a trope of what I want for the future, but is that actually what I feel? Is that actually what I want? Um, I say that I'm making this decision because I want this result, but when I think about how that decision and that process, is that the thing that I want to go to? And again, that requires a lot of like discipline. That requires like the discipline of feeling, the discipline of being slow, the discipline of imagining. But I think in this work, it ends up being critical to be able to hold it all. So I guess to your original question, I don't think it's either or. It's like a bit of both, and that means giving people enough time to do it all. Um, yeah, because the future isn't inevitable. Even the stuff that is currently happening is not inevitable. Um, and so what does it mean? Like AI could just be like Laserdisc or HD DVD or like all these things that we were very present and we spent a lot of money building infrastructure for, and now we don't need.
Mhm.
And so, or even how it's being deployed, how it's being developed, doesn't have to be this way. And so, what does it mean to not rely on the trope of even just like AI, but
Mhm.
really sit into like what is the micro future that we want? How does that feel? And then moving from there. Yeah.
Thank you. I am someone who every day gets more and more scared and nervous about the impact that AI will be having in our culture, on our kids, and on health equity in particular. And also very much appreciate the resistance, and really am hopeful that um, can take us to a more equitable future. Drawing on something you said earlier, Lafayette, about the feeling, I was just reflecting in my head, doing a little microfuturing about the feeling that those who leave their phones behind when they go on camping trips for the weekend feel when they get back. If we can project ourselves into the future, and expect that that kind of feeling of peace is what we could feel if we're not constantly worried that we're getting behind somebody who has more access to some of these tools than we do. Joan, looked like you were going to jump back in. I'm going to move to the other questions, but feel free if you have one more thing you wanted to add.
Yeah, I just wanted to the point of anxiety around the future of AI. I just wanted to call folks' attention to the fact that tomorrow, an essay series that I curated with Data and Society is coming out that really answers this question in a multitude of different ways, and tries to reimagine what the future of AI and health will look like. So yeah, that's coming out tomorrow for folks tapped into the Day in Society Network. And I'll share it around on LinkedIn and everywhere else.
Great. All right. Tons of questions and so many comments, you all. Thank you so much. I cannot wait to read these and share these comments that are in the chat with our panelists. I'm going to go to our questions from the audience. And I think what I'll do so we can get as many of them as possible is see which one of you wants to jump in. And if you really want to give an alternative or complementary perspective, do. But if not, we'll just kind of keep sharing the questions around. So there's a question here. Someone wants to know some examples that you'd like to share for how you invite people into rehearsing the futures that you want. And I know there are folks, David Bickham, you can share some examples in the chat as well.
I mean, I would love to just shout out the work of Jake Dunnigan and Stuart Candy and sort of experiential futures, which is a whole beautiful branch of the futures family tree that, creating situations so that people literally step into scenarios and pre-experience futures is just really exciting and beautiful and allows people to try out and try on different futures and see how those feel and how they feel individually and collectively. So experiential futures are awesome, and they sort of bring science fiction to life, and so different because we feel it in our bodies differently when we're actually in quasi-social or quasi-theatrical experiences where we're like, wow, this is not, we're not in Kansas anymore. No offense to Kansas. But anyway, you're really pre-experiencing different futures and then having a chance to reflect individually and together. So Stuart Candy and Jake Dunnigan, check them out.
Well, Laura, I wonder if you could share just a little bit about the work that you did with your social work futures to envision the new professions or the new tasks that social workers will need to, or new roles social workers will need to take on in
Yeah.
the future.
So I was trying to figure out, I was obsessed with collecting signals of just interesting things. And I can give you an example of one that I was watching. Anyway, I was collecting all these signals and thinking, what do I do with all these signals? And my quest has been to bring futures thinking into the profession of social work. So I've been trying to sort of take on a whole profession. And I started playing around with what if one of these signals developed and then 20 years from now, this was a new kind of social work job. And I'll give you an example of heat. So, as we began to 10 years ago start to have more and more heat events around the world and in this country, I mean, serious heat events. I'm in the Pacific Northwest. We had one in Portland several years ago. Many people died in the city because the city was just ill prepared to deal with heat at the level we had it. And I came up with the idea of a heat coordinator, like a civic heat coordinator, somebody who would really be responsible for preparing and then responding in extreme heat situations. And that could be a very cool job for a social worker of the future. So I put this job description together, and part of it was the experiential part of imagining what would that job description say and what would the qualifications be. And it looks like a real job description. And now I have like 100 of these job descriptions. The interesting part about this is within 2 or 3 years, that job started actually popping up. So now I have actual examples in different cities around the United States where they've actually hired a heat response coordinator. And social workers are actually getting those jobs. So I'm not a soothsayer, but I'm just saying that's how foresight works. You imagine it. And as I said, now we have about 100 of those, and they're really fun. I have a blog, socialworkfutures.com. If you want to look them up, you can see. And it's kind of a game. I play it with my students and I play it with other social workers to just um, take signals that we get and then imagine them growing up into really complicated world situations. And what might we do? What would we do? A related thing that I do in my classes that's quite fun and I think is a fun way for anyone to play with this is I give students a list of science fiction movies. And I just say, okay, your assignment for this week is just to imagine that inexplicably a social worker is dropped into the middle of this science fiction movie. So, okay, Star Wars. Okay, a social worker is just dropped in the middle of that movie. What would the social worker do? And it's really fun. I mean, students really are. It's another kind of experiential exercise because they think, okay, Luke, does he need the social? Who? Darth Vader certainly needs it. What, who do we do in this situation? How does the family therapy going to work there? All of it. It's just really hysterical what they do. But anyway, that's a lot of fun. Just playing, having fun with it, and bringing it to life.
Great, thank you. All right, I'm going to combine a couple of questions. If there's a question, someone wants to know how you include the more than human and an ecocentric approach in futuring. And also in general, we talk a lot, and some of the first futures practices I was exposed to were Western futures practices. And in what ways have you been exposed to other perspectives? There's the Afrofuturism, Indigenous futures, queer futures, disabled futures, and how has that changed the work that you do?
Joan, I see you thinking, but
You go, you go.
yeah, I love sort of thinking about the more than human. I know the work of the co-creation studio at MIT's Open Doc Lab. They have this project called Worlding, which is really about sort of co-creative is or like XR experiences. And I often lead a class on just like place-based storytelling and how do you think of a place from what is the land telling you it wants for the future? What's the water? What are the animals? I use an example of just like my parents just re-sided their house because a bunch of birds were burrowing in the walls. I'm like, cool. This is a signal of what could our future look like if we built our housing to actually be multi-species. And even I think in our planning department, our arts and culture team, we're trying to build that into land use planning because we so much of we talk about land use, we never think about what the land actually wants to do. And so we've been
Mm.
trying to have sort of how do we build in this language into just like planning, how we talk about the conditions of the places that we live. Um, I saw someone put in Alexis Pauline Gunn's work, and I often have I would have my students read some of her work for their like world building studio. And so yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say Alexis Pauline Gumbs Undrowned is for me my all-time favorite example of engaging more than human ways of seeing the world and of engaging the future. In that book, she takes Black feminist lessons from marine animals, and it contains a lot of real gems about how to think about ourselves and derive inspiration from animals and from the natural world. And, thinking about that in reference to Afrofuturism and other types of futurism, non-Western futurisms, I think it's important to say that, like, I do think that there is this cookie cutter brand of futurism, and it's important to be really intentional about when we're referencing that and when we're referencing our own other ways of thinking about the future because they're very different types of practices, and I think for good reason. And I will say, for me, I'm African American and I'm Kenyan. I think both of those two cultures carry their own ways of thinking about not just the future, but about time, about the pace of life. And so in my personal life, I draw on those and bring them into my futurist practices also. And I will say, I think as an Afrofuturist, I really try to adopt a very sort of like universal approach to how Afrofuturism introduces me to other ways of thinking about the future. So engaging in queer and disabled and other types of futures, I think is like part of Afrofuturist work. I think it's incomplete without engaging those ways of thinking. And I also want to add here too that I don't want to frame these as alternatives to
Mm.
Western futurism. I think that these are practices and ideas that have long preceded these types of hegemonic top-down futurisms and will long outlast them as well. And so I just wanted to offer those as these eternal almost ways of thinking about the future as well.
Could I
Great.
also just add beautiful examples? I would encourage everyone to also just look globally because I think on my blog I have a list of 30 or 40 countries that all have, civic futures, sort of, national futures kind of organizations at work embedded into their government systems. And, really looking at what are different countries doing around the world, really attending to kind of global futures voices is also really important. The UN has an enormous futures apparatus that's really worth looking at, that's just full of, I think, examples of how the world might work together, including not only these frameworks like queer futures and disabilities futures, crip futures, as sometimes called, Afrofuturism, all of those, but also just geographically diverse places. The way they practice futuring in Vietnam is very different than the way they practice futuring in Africa. And they all bring something really vibrant to the table. And that's exciting. And we're not doing enough, I think, comparative interlacing of listening to those voices. And I think that's important because one of the futures I want is that we're all working together in ways that are sort of unprecedented and beyond the scope of even anything we've ever seen happen in the world. To me, that's one of the hopeful things. So.
Right. Well, there's several people who are very action oriented in the room and have been inspired and gratified by the fact that we are asserting that these tools are useful and action oriented. What I wanted to draw from their questions is a question for you, which is what is the role of the futurist in the action implementation phase? At what point there's the visioning? At what point is it your responsibility to influence the way that people are thinking and acting and doing, um, versus somebody else who's perhaps has different kinds of skills and perspectives and backgrounds, taking over the leadership role or the facilitation role?
Lafayette, go ahead. I see you
No.
just
No, I was like, it is a good, I was gonna say it's a good question. I think there is the need, part of me sees the work of the futurists is like also the internal work. So like, yes, I'm facilitating sort of the space and teaching these activities, but how, I think, I'm not sure if Laura or Joan brought it up, just like how am I also doing this for myself? So if I want a type of community feeling, how am I partnering with other organizations? But then also how am I bringing this perspective of like the future isn't inevitable into those spaces to sort of empower it. So it's less of implementing everything, but maybe helping activate folks who are already doing the interesting implementation work. Um, Even sort of like teaching in architecture as an urban planner, it's like my work is at the scale of like regions and zoning. I'm not going to help you determine like wall thickness and fenestration, but I can help you think about how does your relationship to land, to climate, to community inform how you practice this, how you think about the built environment at the scale of the building. Um, and so, yeah, I think that's more like, for me at least, my work is trying to experiment with how my practice informs the work of urban planning, but also how do I bring this perspective into other people's work so that they are able to do the sort of microfuturism in their own work.
Laura,
I
you
would
have something to add?
I would say it's a little bit like I think of it like strategic planning. What is our obligation? How many of us have been in any kind of strategic planning process that never got, it was a beautiful strategic plan and it never got touched and it never got used and everyone just cried at the end of it because they realized we're never going to use this. It just gathers dust. I think there is a kind of ethical obligation of all people practicing futures to acknowledge that the thinking, the dreaming, the willing, the manifesting, all of it together in this deeply imaginative space is a huge part of it. But then there is the so what do we do with it part. And we have an ethical obligation, I think, to either get good at transitioning into that implementation part or partnering with other people who are really good at that implementation part and not just simply leaving it. I mean, there's value in creating a book of poetry based on all these ideas, but the truth is people need these things in action. My experience as a social worker in macro spaces is that the people who are good in action are usually the people right in the trenches of an organization or a community. They don't need me to do that, but they often appreciate me making sure that there's a really strong interlacing of whatever we're creating together back to them, back to local capacity to really implement. And without that, I think it's unethical to do this work. I actually do. So I appreciate the question a lot. I think we need to be careful about that. And I will also say sometimes communities or organizations will invest a lot in these plans and then sometimes they don't do anything with them, even though they want to. And so sometimes, really calling out the need to manifest courage, to jump off sometimes what feels like a cliff to do something really different, because that's what the future needs from us, is also something I think we've been called to do as futurists sometimes, like to really help people, help organizations, particularly that I've worked, have courage to do something brave that's really different than anything they've ever done before.
I think in my own work, I found, as we've been suggesting, you're saying, Laura, it's really important to engage the folks who can benefit from what the futuring will bring up in the futuring itself. It's a lot harder to bring. These are trends I think that you should care about. Here's a vision. What do you think of this? To a group of people for just so many reasons. That said, there are times when something is created that is worth sharing. And there are many futurists. I've seen a tool from the IFTF in particular that have tools that help you think through who should hear this, how should they hear this, what will they be thinking about, when are opportunities for you, there's the right time, right information at the right time when people need it. And so folks should certainly look for those. We're running, well, we have some more time. A couple people have brought up in this room the micro futures. I think I heard from Joan and from Lafayette. People are really intrigued by that and want to know a little bit more about what those are and how you use that term or that tool.
Yeah. So I can give some examples that I've witnessed that I do myself. But going back to different types of spiritual practices, like prayer and meditation, I find to be some ways of micro futuring. But I'll also add other practices like journaling, and like mindfulness practices, going for a walk, a run, and things like that. Those are spaces where I feel like people often like their minds are sort of open and relaxed and freed, and it's a space where even subconsciously we sort of make these um, affirmations about our futures. But I also think that there's some ways that they fold into like very mundane ways that we do this in our daily life. Like if you've ever meal prepped, I'm like, that's a good bet on the future that you're gonna want to eat that food in 3 days. And I think, there's other small ways that we sort of, yeah, make those bets. I'm a big planner. Like I'm a huge schedule person. And I think often how that is just a small commitment to steps ahead of me. And then, yeah, going back to families as a place where a lot of this work happens, I know just again, like anecdotally in the work of futurism, that a lot of people emotionally are able to tap into both like anxieties and optimism about the future when they think about their own family, whether that's their children or their parents or their grandparents. Those are relationships where the future often comes to the forefront and comes to bear when we think about the shape of those relationships and things like that. So I think that those are ways that all of us sort of tap into our own futurist tendencies, whether we know it or not. But yeah, Lafayette, I don't know if do you have other examples of that?
No, that was sort of it. I think often we use the word futurist, and it's like, oh, you're some wizard using technology to talk about the future. And it's like, well, no, as long as I think of microfuturism, like for me, facilitating it is helping people see the ways that they are asserting their will into their future in the ways in which they are building the agency to make that happen for themselves. And again, to really try to like think of like the building blocks of these larger stories of the future. And so, um, if it's funny, it's often more when someone says, "Oh, I want this, but I can't have it." Often the question of like, "Well, why not?" Or what would it look like?
Mm.
And even just spending a little bit of time to sort of crack open um, this sort of very constrained imagination of both the power we have in shaping the future, but also our ability to gauge in the future. And so it doesn't have to be big societal things. It could be something as small as how do I want, why can't my house be this way? Or why can't I start dressing this way? Or what would it look like if the city had this thing? And really just taking a little bit of time to engage in that.
So we have one more time for one more question. I'm choosing between a really fun question and a really hard question. I'm going to give you the really hard question because I think it's better to have your voices answer that because several questions relate to this. I'm going to let you answer the really fun question in the chat as we're winding down. So several people have talked about, and you have talked about We talked about anticipatory trauma. We talked about grief. Folks have talked about burnout in futuring and also in this work. And so just wonder if you have a little bit more to add in terms of either generally where folks can go to find out what futuring tools. Joan, I've seen you work and seen that this is part of your process. Often you go into groups and there's a lot of grief and trauma, and as you suggested, Laura, that needs to happen first. And there are tools and um, perspectives on that. So want to know if any of you have anything else to add for folks.
It brings to mind, Lori, there's a great book. I can't remember who wrote it. It's a book called Normal, and it's a book about a treatment program for burned out futurists because they get a condition called abyss gaze.
Mm.
And so, in that sense, I think it's equally like important to focus on anticipatory joy and success. And part of this imagination is imagining the moments that we realize we made it, we might make it. What little things do we see right now that we realize, wow, if that grew, we might make it. We might actually make it. And I see those things. So anyway, that's some of it for me. That's a really important thing. Beware of abyss gaze.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah, I was just going to say, I will add that I think something that's maybe clear throughout this conversation is that futurism is a really emotional practice. I don't think it's possible to do this work without tapping into your emotions, even inadvertently. And so I think my broad maybe advice here is that the same tactics that folks use to like regulate their emotions or tap into their emotions, breath work, meditation, going for a walk, being outside, um, thinking about your past, thinking about the present. All of those are ways, like things that I try to fold into my futurist practice, like basic, almost like therapy, is something that I think is important. And yeah, I want folks to know that you're not doing it wrong if you're feeling a lot of feelings when you're doing futurism. That's the right space to be in. And it's always worthwhile to engage those feelings.
that is a
Lafayette?
beautiful point, Joan.
Yeah. And I'm glad that that's a beautiful point. And also, Laura, I'm glad the like abyss gaze, because I think it was like a year ago where I was just like, I actually don't want to talk about and think about the future. Don't ask me what I think, how I feel. It is a lot. And I think it's the thing that was helpful for me also was just like, I think someone put this in the chat. It may have been Trista, of just like the power of boredom. Um, I think when you engage with time in the way that this practice does, everything sort of collapses on yourself, on like around you, and everything feels very present. And finding moments to like create space is really important. Finding moments. This is gonna sound very nihilistic, but it was very helpful for me. Is that in however many billions of years, this planet, something's gonna explode, and that the stars aren't going to remember this, and that's fine. You can still work and do beautiful things, but you can also relax. You can also chill. You can try to find pleasure in the community that you live in. You can be curious about what's happening around you. I think even Laura just talking when you mentioned just looking what other places are doing, it's been helpful for me to be like, everything feels on fire right now in my context, but there are really exciting, beautiful things happening in other people's lives. In other parts of the world, there are other futures sort of emerging. And if I stop staring intently and trying to lead it, I can sort of get inspired from other folks. And so, yeah, it is a lot of just like take the space to stop looking at the abyss and sort of be present.
Thank you.
You're not failing for doing that.
Thank you. So turn away from the abyss, experience some boredom and some joy, and pick up this beautiful report, or click on the link and spend some time in the report as well. I'm going to read the fun question that you all can answer in the question some in the chat. Someone was curious about the difference between futuring and manifestation. How they might be similar related. So feel free to answer that. As I wrap us up, because that's all the time that we have for today. We're not going to shut this off immediately so that folks, we're loving this chat. We're loving this info. We're going to go through all of it. really carefully. Feel free to put anything in there that you'd like us to know about the work that you do in this realm, or any ideas that you have, ahas, again, hunches. I want to thank you all for joining us, making this such a rich and rewarding conversation. If you like what you've heard here and you want more futuring in your inbox, you can sign up for our newsletter and other updates by using the link that's going to be put in the chat or by scanning the QR code. And if you sign up soon, you will receive stickers. We will send you a set of stickers, future-facing stickers we've designed to spark joy and conversations. You can check out our collection of Imagining Better Futures stickers also at the link that's in the chat. Also, please take the survey that pops up on your screen when you exit. We really, really value your feedback. As we're winding down here, I just want to be sure to thank my colleague at RWJF, Jody Struve. I want to thank Gemma Weymouth from Burness, Jenna Ryans from Dot Connector, all the folks from Dot Connector, and the team at Ghost Note Agency and Spensley Productions, and everyone else who helped organize today's webinar. And of course, continued love and appreciation for the invaluable contribution of our report author, Jessica Clark, who joined our ancestors in 2025. Jessica, we both miss you and we feel your presence among us today.